When we think about World War II, our minds go straight to the big stuff, right? Epic battles, famous generals, the clash of armies. But what if I told you that one of the most decisive American weapons in that war was reality? Just plain old everyday reality. This is the absolutely wild story of how hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, men who had been steeped in Nazi propaganda for a decade, were brought to America as prisoners of war and had their entire worldview completely dismantled. Not by force, not by torture, but by the overwhelming, almost casual power of what they saw with their own two eyes. So I want you to put yourself in the boots of a guy named Hermann Butcher. It's June 1943. You're a seasoned German officer. You fought for Rommel in the legendary Afrika Korps. Your entire life, you've been fed a steady diet of propaganda that says America is a failing nation. It's weak, it's decadent, it's racially impure, and it's teetering on the brink of collapse. Then you're captured, put on a ship, and you step onto a dock in Norfolk, Virginia. And the world you see is so profoundly, fundamentally different from what you were told that the only words you can manage to get out are, "The Americans are crazy." That single sentence right there is the first tremor of a psychological earthquake that's about to level everything these men thought they knew. For Butcher and the thousands of other POWs with him, this wasn't just being moved from one place to another. He later called it the first impossibility. See, they were expecting to find a country that was grim, hostile, rationing everything, probably terrified. What they found instead was something their minds just weren't equipped to handle. Just look at this breakdown, because this is where the De-Nazification begins, literally within minutes of arrival. The propaganda promised a nation on its knees. What they saw was staggering industrial power. They saw white and black dock workers, a sight that should have been impossible according to Nazi racial laws, operating massive cranes and forklifts with a casual efficiency that was just breathtaking. But you know what was really unnerving? It wasn't just the power, it was the normalcy. Civilians were just walking around near active warships. There were kids selling newspapers. And down the pier, a brass band was playing for a war bond rally. America wasn't just fighting a war. It seemed to be having a pretty good time while doing it. That sheer, unbothered confidence was the first major crack in their ideological foundation. And then the impossibilities just started piling up, one after another, each one a direct assault on everything they'd been taught. You see, their own doctrine was to treat prisoners horribly. But here, an American officer reads them their rights under the Geneva Convention in flawless German. A sergeant, who they can tell is Jewish, asks if any of the prisoners are also Jewish and need kosher meals. At first, they thought it had to be some kind of sick joke, but it wasn't. Wounded Germans were getting shots of penicillin, this miracle drug they'd only heard whispers about, the same exact medicine given to American GIs. And then came the ultimate violation of their racial purity laws, a black medical technician drawing blood from a white German officer. They even ate in the same building as American sailors who seemed way more interested in a baseball game on the radio than the master race sitting across the room. Every single one of these moments was a small, quiet, but devastating blow against the Nazi ideology. That shock at the port was just the appetizer. As they were put on trains and sent deep into the American heartland, they saw even more baffling sights. Miles of factories with huge glass windows not blacked out or hidden from bombers. It was just out in the open. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could prepare them for what life was like in the camps themselves, places like Camp Hearn in Texas. They were about to enter a prison that for many of them was a serious upgrade from the homes they'd left behind. And listen, don't just take my word for it. This isn't American propaganda. This is a direct quote from Emil Sandstrom, a Swiss Red Cross inspector, a neutral observer. His official report in 1943 flat out stated that the conditions in the American POW camps surpassed what many of these prisoners had experienced as civilians back home in Germany, even before the war started. Just let that sink in for a second. Your enemy's prison camp is nicer than your own house. What does that do to your morale? What does that say about the system you're fighting for? So what does that actually look like? Well, first, we're talking about barracks with electric lights you could flip on and off, indoor plumbing, hot showers, individual beds with actual mattresses, not just a straw pallet on some cold floor. These were luxuries for many German civilians. But the real mind-bender, the thing that made them think this was all some elaborate trick, was self-governance. The American camp commanders basically told them, look, you guys are going to elect your own leaders, handle your own internal disputes, organize your own sports leagues and choirs. To men from a totalitarian state where you did what you were told or you disappeared, the idea of letting your enemy govern themselves was just insane. And then you had the camp canteen. Think about that. A store inside a prison camp for the enemy. Here, the prisoners could use money they earned from doing voluntary labor to buy things: cigarettes, Coca-Cola, magazines, even musical instruments. Now, this was more than just being comfortable. This was a masterclass in capitalism and democracy. It introduced the idea of consumer choice. It gave them a sense of personal agency. It treated them not like a faceless horde of enemies, but as individuals, as customers. And it was a taste of a world that was completely alien to them. But the real education started when prisoners began working outside the wire to help with labor shortages. This is where they came face to face with America's most powerful and subtle weapon, its seemingly infinite casual abundance. This was a kind of power that didn't need to shout or posture, because it was just everywhere. To get a sense of the scale, look at this number. Some prisoners were sent to work on the King Ranch in Texas. One single ranch. 825,000 acres. That is bigger than the entire state of Rhode Island. They would see massive combine harvesters doing the work of an entire village back home. They saw fleets of trucks and even private airplanes being used just to check on cattle. This wasn't the small-scale farming they knew. This was agriculture as a form of overwhelming industrial might. It was beyond their comprehension. You know, sometimes the biggest revelations come in the smallest moments. Herman Butcher, that officer from the beginning, he later wrote about seeing an American farmhand take a couple bites of an apple, decide he was done with it, and just toss it on the ground. That simple act, the thoughtless, casual waste of perfectly good food by a regular working guy, was absolutely stunning to these German officers. These were men who had seen their own soldiers starving in the North African desert, literally kill each other for a stale crust of bread. And here, a laborer throws away an apple. That half-eaten apple said more about America's real power than 1,000 tanks ever could. And here, working out in a segregated South, is where their ideology really started to short-circuit. They saw a paradox that their rigid black and white worldview couldn't process. Think about this. The German prisoners, the white enemies of the state, could walk into a diner in town with their guards and get served a meal. But the black American soldiers guarding them, their supposed allies in the war, would be refused service at that exact same counter. The prisoners could go to a movie and sit in the main section, while their own guards had to go up to the segregated balcony. This completely scrambled their ideas about racial hierarchy. How could your ally be treated worse than your enemy? It showed a messy, complicated reality that the simple, brutal logic of Nazism just had no answer for. Now, it would be easy to think that all of this was just a fluke, right? A happy accident of American wealth and its strange customs. And for a while, it kind of was. But pretty quickly, the US military realized what a profound psychological effect all this was having. So they decided to turn this accident into a deliberate, highly sophisticated strategy. The goal wasn't just to keep prisoners behind a fence anymore. It was to actively win the war for their minds. So let's ask that question directly. Was this transformation just dumb luck? Well, the Army's Special Projects Division looked at what was happening and said, no, we can actively encourage this. We can actually weaponize American reality. This is how the Army psychologists broke it down. The camps weren't one big block of Nazis. They figured about 15% were the hardcore, true believers. You couldn't change them. Another 10% were secretly anti-Nazi from the start. But in the middle, you have this huge 75% chunk of guys who are just soldiers. Not political, just trying to survive. And the Army's strategy was pure genius. They ignored the fanatics, they secretly empowered the anti-Nazis, and they focused all of their efforts on winning over that massive group in the middle. It was psychological warfare, fought with books and movies instead of bombs and bullets. And these were their weapons. They stocked the camp libraries with books that were banned back in Germany, authors who told the truth about World War I or criticized totalitarianism. They set up college correspondence courses. They let the prisoners start their own newspapers. And they watched as those papers slowly evolved from spouting the Nazi party line to having actual, genuine democratic debates. But maybe the most powerful weapon of all, they gave them access to American radio and newspapers. And for the first time, these men read and heard Americans openly criticizing their own government, making fun of their own president. For men who came from a country where saying the wrong thing about the government got you and your family killed, seeing a democracy that was actually strengthened by dissent, well, that was the most powerful lesson of all. So after all of this, did it work? What was the actual result of this huge, accidental, turned-on-purpose experiment in social engineering? Well, the data we have from both the end of the war and for decades after tells a pretty clear story. It was one of the most stunningly successful psychological operations in military history. I mean, the numbers are just jaw-dropping. Out of over 400,000 German POWs in the US, the escape rate was less than 1%. You know how many confirmed cases of sabotage there were? 7 total. Not 7%, just 7 incidents. Organized refusals to work were practically unheard of. The vast majority of these men weren't just following the rules, they were actively cooperating. These are not the stats of a resentful enemy population biding their time. These are the numbers of men whose entire will to fight had been completely eroded and replaced by something new. And here it is. This might be the most important number of all. After the war, when these men were sent back to a Germany that was just rubble and ash, American authorities surveyed them, and they found that nearly 3/4 of them, 74%, now held favorable views of American democracy. Think about that. The program didn't just pacify them, it converted them. It turned men who were sent to destroy democracy into its newest and most fervent supporters. And this is the long-term payoff. This is why it all matters. These men went home and they became the very foundation of the new democratic West Germany. 48 of them were elected to the Bundestag, the German parliament. Over 300 became mayors or city councilors, and thousands more became the engineers and factory managers who, using the American methods they had seen and learned, helped create the West German economic miracle. America had planted the seeds of democracy in the most unlikely garden you could possibly imagine. This quote from a former prisoner, a man who went on to become a major German industrialist, just sums it all up perfectly. We had seen the future, and we knew it worked. They didn't get a lecture about democracy. They didn't read a pamphlet. They lived it. They saw its messy, contradictory, abundant, and ultimately resilient reality firsthand. They came to America as enemy soldiers, and they left as students who had just graduated from the most important class of their lives. So in the end, this whole incredible story really makes you ask a pretty fundamental question, doesn't it? What does it actually mean to win a war? Is it just about defeating an enemy on the field of battle? Or is the real, lasting victory won in the hearts and minds of people? The experience of these German POWs suggests that the most powerful ideas don't need to be forced on people. Sometimes they just need to be demonstrated. And it leaves us with a really powerful thought for today. What if the best way to defeat an ideology you oppose isn't to crush it, but to show its followers a vision of the future so compelling, so attractive, that they choose to help you build it themselves?